Okay.
All right, PFAS vulnerabilities and mitigation potentials is subject for tonight's RAC seminar. Joseph Dinardo, a retired toxicologist, will be our presenter. I will let Joe describe what PFAS is and what our concern is during his talk. I'm Eli Fishpaw, host for the 2022 RAC seminar series. Question and comments will be managed by Gretchen Sokol, a member of the RAC board. Before we get to Joe's talk, I want to let you know that on June 15th, 7 p.m., the RAC seminar will explore household scale composting to capture the life value of food residue and prevent its waste. Dinardo's advocacy has resulted in RAC forming a working group that has engaged in communication with administrators of the Maury Service Authority, our local sewage treatment plant, and the Blue Ridge Resource Authority, the local landfill, to encourage monitoring of PFAS levels and mitigating identified risk. Dinardo retired in 2013 as a personal care products toxicologist, formulator, and regulatory affairs person with 45 years of experience. Since then, he has pursued environmental toxicology concerns associated with various chemicals such as PFAS, PCBs, dioxins, various phenol-based chemicals, etc. For RAC, this inquiry into PFAS vulnerabilities and mitigation potential occurs without a unified conclusion. We want to be open to understanding the dilemmas in our process of brainstorming what the solution might be. Joe's talk will facilitate that process. So Joe, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eli. I appreciate the introduction. And so a couple of things about tonight's lecture. One, it's bordering within about an hour or so of my bedtime, so please forgive me if I start slurring words or not speaking correctly. The other interesting thing is that it's always better when you're performing live or doing a presentation live to be able to do question answers as we're talking. But because it's a little bit difficult in this format, what we did do is we put, if you notice on the slide pages, in the upper left-hand corner, the slides are numbered. So if I get to a slide and you have a question, write the number down and write your question down. And then we will have a question and answer period that Gretchen will moderate for us at the end of the presentation. And like Eli said, especially, there are no definitive answers for this problem. This is really, I'm trying to just present it more from an informational standpoint to tell you a little bit about what these chemicals are and so forth. And in fact, let's go to the presentation goal lines. Everybody see that okay? Yep. Okay. All right, so the first slide of the presentation goals for tonight was, again, first having some general information.
Joe, I don't see the screen share. Did you get screen share?
Okay, hold on one second then. Let's get Jim.
There's a little button on the bottom, a little green button. Yep. Says screen share.
Where's screen share? Sorry. Right there. That one, thank you.
There we go. I got it.
Oh, that's okay. We're good. Yeah, I'm fine over there. Okay, everybody, you can see that now?
Yep.
Very good. Okay, so the presentation goals for tonight, again, this is primarily for informational kind of background stuff, but it's a general information on Per and Polyfluoroalkyl Substances. That is what the acronym PFAS stands for. We're going to also get into a little bit of the health risk associated with PFASs. And primarily, there, at last count, I believe, if I quote the EPA, there's a little over 3,000 publications and papers out there that relate to a variety of different adverse reactions and so forth. So this topic is extremely large and very difficult to present. So I'm not going to present everything that there is on this topic because we would be here for literally months. But one of the things I will focus on, because it really is what's basically impacting us in Rockbridge County, would be the dangers associated with PFAS association with landfill leachate, biosolids, and effluent. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And we're going to talk about perhaps a mitigation process for some of the risks that are associated with PFASs. And again, please, there are no necessarily correct answers or no specific answers that exist that any of us are aware of. So please feel free to brainstorm and think about these things. This is going to be a community project. And the way to handle this issue and concern is through community. And that's one thing that we all do well when we're faced with major problems in community. We work together, we come together. So I'm really hoping that we can use this, I guess, potential issue that we have as a way to come together, work together, and make a better place for all of us in Rockbridge County. So again, that's just the general goals, and hopefully with your help, we'll achieve that. So some of the general information, just to give you a historical perspective about this particular, or these types of particular chemicals. This goes back to 1938 with a gentleman named Roy Plunkett, who accidentally invented something that we now call Teflon. And you have to understand that in science, as much as people profess that they have the ability to do a lot of things, serendipity is truly the mother of invention. And that holds true in 1938, and it still holds true to today. He invented this in 1938, but DuPont actually ended up commercializing it in 45. In 1942, there was a very interesting development. There was a General Groves. He was the head of the Manhattan Project. That was the atomic bomb that we were developing back in the 40s. And they ran into a really interesting issue. The material was so radioactive that it literally melted every gasket that they put in there in the bomb to hold it together. So basically, they had all the workings of everything, but did not have a way of containing the material inside the bomb. General Groves commissioned DuPont, and basically they came up with a Teflon gasket, if you would, and that created or completion of the bomb, which allowed it to be used. In 1954, DuPont was asked, they received an inquiry about something what we call C8 or PFOA. PFOA is a very specific type of PFAS, and we'll go into that more. But what the C8 represents is basically, it means that it has 8 carbons. Okay, and basically DuPont was asked, well, is this material toxic? Is it hazardous? Is it a problem? It took them about 7 years to come up to the conclusion, which is pretty typical, that their house toxicologist said, yep, that the substance was toxic and should be handled with extreme care. Private industry looked at the same question around the same time, and in about 2 years, they came out with the concept where they knew it was a problem, primarily because it binds to proteins in human blood. And we'll talk a little bit more about the half-life or how long they stay in our bodies. But this is an incredible find and also an unusual find for many chemicals. So basically, a lot of the problems we're going to talk about, we understood in the 50s and the 60s. And in the 60s, DuPont is the major manufacturer, or was the major manufacturer of basically PFOA. PFOS got involved with 3M in the making of what we call aqueous film forming foam. This is what firefighters use. And it's an extremely big issue, but in the 60s, 3M got involved, wanted to do some tox testing, and they basically also came to the conclusion that these materials should be regarded as toxic. So there's no surprise about the toxicity of this compound. I think where the surprises come to is how big and how fast this molecule took off and how many chemicals they made from this molecule and the ubiquitous of them. And that's really where the major issue is. So in the 70s through the 2000s, starts the burying and the dumping of these materials in various places. Minnesota, is where 3M had 2 different landfills. And then also in West Virginia, DuPont in Parkersburg. And if you've not seen the movie Dark Water, it's a really, like anything in Hollywood, it's a little bit over sensationalized, but it's an accurate and a pretty complete perspective of what West Virginia went through with their PFAS contamination in their town. So the part that actually nobody usually likes is talking about the chemistry, but the chemistry is extremely important for several reasons. One, I want to introduce you to, if you've not seen in the lower left-hand corner there is the table of periodic elements. And if you look at the group that's highlighted, this group is called halogens. It's a class of chemicals. And if you notice, F is for fluorine, Cl is chlorine, and Br is bromine. I have iodine and so on, but the main ones that we're really concerned with today is the fluorine. But I want you to also understand halogens as a general, just as a general class of chemicals, are very problematic. At the upper corner, we have what we call PCBs, okay? Polychlorinated biphenyls, okay? So we know that these are carcinogens. We also have the same issues with these in the environment. We've been monitoring them, checking them, and even though these materials have been banned, there's a back door where they can be still actually out there in the environment and end up becoming a problem again. To the right of that, up in the upper right-hand corner, something that you might remember called Freon. And again, what I want you to see is the carbon relationship with chlorines and fluorines. Okay, the first one, Freon 11, is a triple chlorine and one fluorine. Freon 12 is 2 of each. The material down in the underneath this, which is carbon tetrachloride, the carbon with 4 chlorines attached to it. If we were to remove the chlorines and put fluorines there, you would have the strongest chemical fluorine, carbon fluorine bonding PFOS that we know of. It takes about temperatures of about 1400 degrees centigrade to break those molecules down. And again, carbon tetrachloride is a fairly well-known liver carcinogen. And so you have PCBs, and also next to that, you have PBBs, polybrominated biphenyls. These materials are what we used earlier on in relationship to flame retardants in plastics and clothings and furniture and things of that nature. Again, very toxic as compounds. So again, not a lot here. I just want you to understand that halogens are a class of chemicals that have always been problematic and will always continue to be problematic, not just from a human toxicology standpoint, but also from an environmental issue. So from a general chemistry structure of what a PFOS is, basically this slide I took from an EPA presentation. And if you look at where the magnifying glasses are, basically all this is showing you is 3 different types of endings on these molecules. So when we use the term a PFOS, PFOS, what we're talking about is something that has a sulfonic acid, okay? And let's see if I can get, okay. So hopefully you can see that. My pointer, this is the sulfonic acid group on the end of the PFOS. This one is a carboxylic acid, and these are the primary endings for most of these molecules. Now, again, remember, there's somewhere between 4,500 and 9,000 of these chemicals out there, but this is very important, the endings, and this one is a polyfluorinated. This one ends in a hydroxyl group, or what we would call an OH. Anything that ends in OH is basically an alcohol class. And again, the reason why these endings are important is because when we get to the level of mitigation or trying to figure out a way to remove these compounds, several people have been looking at ways to complex different things to the ends of these materials and be able to pull it out or to remove it from wherever the material is. Kind of a mitigation process thing. The other thing that I'd like to tell you, just from a general standpoint, when we talk about these chemicals, we refer to them as per or poly. Per basically means that every carbon in the structure has at least 1 fluorine attached to it. Poly means that there are some fluorines attached to carbons. It's not completely saturated. So in other words, not every carbon. So just a simple kind of clarification between the chemistries. One of the other issues in chemistries, and again, this is not something you need to really write down or do anything about, but you know, originally when PFOS and PFOA were found to be issues and problems, those are compounds that have 8 carbon lengths, or okay. Everybody said, okay, well, we're canceling them out, we're phasing them out, we've come up with these other molecules, and we're good. And the answer to that is no, we are not good. Several of these molecules are not necessarily stable in the form they're in. So you create what's called these intermediates. And these intermediates can create a variety of different chemical reactions. And when you see an arrow pointing in a direction, that means that is the direction of the reaction. When you see an arrow with 2 going both ways, that means the chemical reaction will try to reach equilibrium where these 2 chemicals react. But the biggest problem with these intermediates and some of these smaller molecules is that they will form what we call PFOA again. So we have different types of PFOSs as well that they will form. So just because PFOA and PFOS have been pretty much discontinued probably around the early 2000s or so, that doesn't mean they're gone from our environment or from wherever we are. They can interact with each other and create molecules that will form PFOA and PFOS again. Okay, so that's basically all the chemistry that I wanted to cover. And hopefully you got past it. It's not very confusing, and trying to make it simple. If I confused you, just write down what your questions are and we'll try to unconfuse everybody later on. Okay, so we want to start talking about some of the health risks associated with PFASs. And the big issue here is, in order to understand really the health risks, you have to understand some very basic principles in toxicology. And the first rule of toxicology came up by the father of toxicology about 500 years ago, made an observation and basically said that the dose makes the poison. What that means is toxicology is not a democratic society or a democratic science, if you would. You know, in our country, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. Well, in toxicology, every compound is guilty until proven innocent. So that's a really, really important point and a point of distinction to understand. There are some things that our bodies and our environment can tolerate, break down, and detoxify at certain levels. And at other levels, it becomes overwhelming and toxic reactions tend to occur. So that's basically the whole principle, really, of toxicology. It's the dose that makes the poison. And so that's very, very important. The other principle that we're going to just kind of briefly touch upon tonight, too, is what we call the precautionary principle. This is the do no harm concept. And this is a practice that when you have an issue with a compound, you can't necessarily tie down the dose, or you're not familiar enough with the exposures that are there. And there seems to be some high level of risk involved. In this particular case, we're going to talk a lot about PFOA and the carcinogenicity potential of this to cause cancer in people. The general practice is to always err on the safe side. Okay, we're talking about public health here. So it's very important. There's great variability, biological variability, not only between humans, but between animals, between, you know, plants, our environment. And so everything can react differently. So we do have to take a variety of precautions to be careful in what our decisions are. Otherwise, as often happens, we jump out of a frying pan to avoid the heat and end up in the fire. Not an uncommon situation for us. So this is all going to kind of lead to try to understanding the dose of things. And again, to understand the dose, you have to understand, well, what am I being exposed to and how am I being exposed to it? This graphic basically represents just some, actually, of the ways that we are exposed to a variety of PFASs. Everything from dental floss, if you use like a Teflon treated or a Glide kind of dental floss, well, guess what? That's treated with PFASs. You know, when you go to McDonald's and you get those French fries and you don't want that grease going through the bag and onto your car seat on the way home, those containers are sprayed with PFAS to minimize the oil transfer. They're in rain gear, all kinds of different products. But the thing that's even more concerning, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is how these compounds and chemicals get into our food chain. And that's really the most problematic thing of all. So the Center for Disease Control, every few years, 5-10 years, they look at people's blood and urine and what kind of chemicals are in there. And so just to show you how ubiquitous these chemicals are, 98% of the American population has one or more PFAS in their blood. The last reading that they took around 2014 was about 10,000 parts per trillion. That was the average. In comparison, that sounds pretty terrible in relationship to that some of the requirements we're coming out with. The health advisory level, according to EPA, of this in drinking water is that you can come in contact with 70 parts per trillion. New York City has a different level. They came out with 10. Maine has uses a toxic registry level. They have 2 parts per trillion. So all these different states and federal levels have some kind of advisory level set. But the reality is we already have 10,000 parts of it, more than likely, per trillion in our body to start with, in our blood. And remember, in 1956, they basically found out that these materials bind to our blood. So again, very, very important. The good side to this information, if there is such a thing, is that when they first started doing this testing in 1999, the average level in people's blood was 35,000 parts per trillion. So again, we are seeing some benefit associated with some levels of decrease of these compounds being used. However, there is no control of them, and we still have this major issue with trying to understand the dose. So part of understanding dose as well is understanding how long you're actually exposed to these particular materials. They call these compounds forever chemicals. And basically 20 years ago, we knew that they existed. We didn't call them forever chemicals. We called them persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, P-O-P-S. Forever chemicals is a fairly new name. It's just obviously simpler to remember, and it makes more sense to people. But when we take a look at these compounds, and in toxicology and pharmacology, we measure things more in half-life. There's a variety of different ways to measure it, but what half-life basically is the amount of time or that a compound will survive in an environment, whether it's your body or the water or the land, for half their life. So in other words, 8 years in your blood means 16 years in reality, because 8 years is a half-life. Okay, 92 years in land or water really relates to about 184 years, or about 200 years. Okay, it's 2 centuries that it's going to stay in the land. These materials also can volatilize, and the half-life in air is about 130 days. Again, you double that, you come out to almost about 9 months. Again, the issue with this is that because these compounds are so ubiquitous in our world, and these compounds stay everywhere, not only just in our body, but in our environment, it creates a tremendous problem with trying to understand or come up with a dose or a level that is actually safe for everyday use. To the left of the screen, again, we talked about this very earlier on, but the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. It takes basically at least 1,000 degrees centigrade or 14 and up to 1,400 degrees centigrade for the kind of the carbon tetrafluoride kind of compound. So again, they're very, very difficult to get rid of. They're ubiquitous. They hang around everywhere for a very, very long period of time. Just generally in toxicology or in pharmacology, we get worried when compounds stay in the blood for more than a day or two. So this is obviously a fairly huge concern, and this is something that sets this chemical class a little bit different than the other chemical classes. One of the other things that, again, EPA and FDA deal with is obviously they're supposed to be checking to make sure that we're not being overexposed to certain types of materials. So when a contaminant is considered carcinogenic, and PFOA is considered carcinogenic at this moment, there's questions of the other PFASs, EPA puts 2 different parameters in place. In other words, instead of coming up with a safe drinking level of 70 parts per trillion, or something to that effect, if it's a carcinogenic material, EPA says, well, we have to set this as a goal, and we have to set it as 0 level of exposure if there are 2 parameters that are at play here. The first one is there evidence that the chemical may cause cancer? So about a year or so ago, or maybe a little bit less, the National Toxicology Program, that's part of HHS, our health system, Human Health and Services, basically came out with PFOA demonstrating clear evidence of carcinogenicity in certain situations, and had some evidence of carcinogenicity in others. And it involved both causing liver and pancreas carcinogens or cancers, tumors in male rats, as well as having other issues in the liver, kidney, force, and so on. The International Agency, the International Agency of Cancer Research, that's called IARC. They're part of the World Health Organization. They also monitor carcinogenicity data, and they have found in 2 other rodent studies, a study done in trout, and in 3 human epidemiological studies. These studies were done in people that lived around either manufacturing plants or biosolid manufacturing plants, things of that nature. And there were signs of a variety of different cancers, obviously. So I don't think it's much of a stretch here when our government turns around and says that there's clear evidence for carcinogenicity, that the chemical is indeed carcinogenic. The other parameter that EPA uses in this kind of situation is that there is no dose below which the chemical is considered safe. Again, because these compounds are so ubiquitous in our world and our environment, we cannot calculate the dose. So not only can you not calculate the dose, but it's also a carcinogen. And so this brings the regulatory groups into a different level where they say, you know, we have to set this MCLG at 0. The same thing kind of applies to the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. They monitor basically our food substances. And FDA controls chemicals in foods and food wraps that are carcinogens. There's a law that was put into effect, I believe, around 1958, that's still in effect, called the Delaney Amendment or the Delaney Clause. This is a law that was passed by our government that says it doesn't matter what the dose is that caused cancer. It doesn't matter if it caused cancer in animals or in human models. If it causes cancer, it cannot be in our food chain. So that is the other major impact that we need to be concerned about, because I'll show you how these things get into our food chain in a few minutes. But this is how our regulatory agencies handle materials that are carcinogenic, either in our drinking water or in our foods. Okay, so this is my one propaganda slide. I kind of couldn't resist. But again, we're talking about chemicals that we knew about their toxicity for 60, 70 years, which is not really a very unusual situation. In fact, I could probably rattle off at least a dozen or two different chemicals in the last 100 years have been this problem. But one of the, probably my favorite, is smoking won't kill you. You know, this was a propaganda ad that industry put out many years ago in relationship to cigarettes being healthy for you, good for you. In fact, unfortunately, my father passed away several years ago from lung cancer. He was a smoker. And I asked him, you know, well, where did you start smoking, or why did you start smoking? And he started smoking in World War II because they would give him 2 packs of cigarettes in his rations. And so that's what he basically did. So, you know, industry has always tried to justify a variety of different concerns and problems by kind of writing it off and kind of minimizing it. In fact, there's a great book out there called Doubt is Their Product. And I believe he wrote a sequel to it as well. But it really is a fascinating story and understanding about how materials are marketed and how companies put enough information or misinformation out there to kind of confuse us. To the left side of our screen, you'll see that 180 countries banned PFASs in 2019. This is part of what they call the Stockholm Accord, and this is run by the World Health Organization. Europe in 2020 said they were going to ban all PFASs, and actually about 2 months ago or a month or two ago, they actually did pass that bill. So PFASs, all of them, thousands of them, are now banned in Europe and in 180 different countries. So again, this is a regulation side, and our country tends to be a little bit less or more conservative in relationship to wanting to put bans on things for a variety of reasons. And so we allow companies to do self-regulation. And if you look to your right of your screen and look at this slide, what I want to point out is that the first two, the red and the white, are basically ads, full-page ads that Nike ran in different types of magazines. The first one was run in 2011. It said, Nike comes clean with their chemicals and elimination pledge. They're getting rid of toxic compounds in all of their products by 2020. So underneath, or in the white, the next headline is Nike to replace 10 priority chemicals with cleaner alternatives by 2025. So obviously after 10 years, they realized that they couldn't take these products out or didn't take these products out because financially it costs something and it takes time, and that could be problematic. So whenever we leave companies to self-regulate, we leave ourselves open for more marketing propaganda and less likelihood that the company is really caring more about public health than about their personal profits. So that's really important to understand. Recently, there was another article in the blue section. Chemours is a company that I'm not sure how it really got set up. If you ask me, I think it was kind of a job that DuPont sat with these people. It's a very interesting story. If you want to look at it, you can certainly Google how did Chemours come about. But they make something called Gen X. Okay, Generation X was supposed to be the new level of PFASs that were not toxic, not problematic, which of course that it is not true. They are quite problematic and they still have all the same safety issues and concerns. But Chemours kind of did a stretch and turned around and said that, hey, if we ban all these PFASs, we're going to increase global climate change because these compounds basically reduce friction, which is heat. And so if you increase friction, you're going to increase heat. If you increase heat, you're going to increase global warming. It's kind of a bit of a stretch, obviously. However, my second comment under that, I was in a Virginia Department of Health meeting on PFASs, and one of the lawyers that represents the chemical company, we were discussing, should we ban all the PFASs, just like in the Stockholm Accord and in Europe? And basically, this lawyer made a plea saying, if you ban all these chemicals, we could be missing the next cure for cancer. So in retrospect to what Chemours was saying in relationship to global warming, it doesn't sound as far as a stretch as having a compound that causes cancer that's actually going to cure cancer. So again, you have to be concerned, you have to be aware of propaganda and misinformation. And I don't think we have ever lived in a time with as much misinformation as we are now. So it's very scary in that relationship. Okay, so that pretty much concludes really what I wanted to talk about from a health risk standpoint. I do want to take a little bit more of a focus looking at landfill leachate, biosolids, and effluent. So this is just one of a variety of stories or a variety of pieces of data I could pull out that will demonstrate that landfills have very, very high levels of PFAS in them. Not because they put them in there, okay, but because we unfortunately put them in there. That slide with all of the different types of consumer products. Also, again, as we eat things, inhale things, when we excrete, we also excrete these chemicals. They also go down into the waste stream and create more PFASs in other areas. But the common practice that we're doing lately, or actually have been doing for a while, is we take landfill and, they cover it up. And there is a, as it rains and as the materials degrade and so forth, things become liquefied. It goes out into a drain and it's collected into a pool. And this is what we call a leachate, okay? And leachate, these are 4 different landfills in New York. And to the left, because I want you to see actually the volume. I mean, in relationship, the Lexington landfill, I got this information from annual reports, so it may be very accurate. It could be a little off. But anyway, I just want you to see that these landfill sites in New York have millions of tons of garbage that they're putting in there. So therefore, they have a much higher relationship to potential PFAS in the leachate. We're a little bit smaller of a town. Our population is not as great, but even 1/10, okay, of the waste, even though it's not a linear relationship, it would be nice if we could just move things over 1 decimal and say, okay, instead of in particular, I'm sorry, I keep pointing, but here, instead of having 15,200 of this particular PFAS, and by the way, this PFAS is what replaced ScotchGard and is just as toxic and just as dangerous again, unfortunately. But if we were just to move it over a 1/10, we would have between a few thousand and a few hundred parts per trillion. So basically speaking, this material is so toxic that a few parts per trillion is really something to be overly concerned about. Again, so we have no idea. At least to the best of my knowledge, I don't think any of us have tested or anyone has tested for PFASs in leachate or in biosolids, but this is the concern. This is state after state after state, landfill after landfill. These results are quite common and quite they can be duplicated quite easily. So this is the first concern. Obviously, we really should monitor what our landfill has in it and what we're doing with it. So the leachate, well, before I go to that slide, the leachate itself, when it's removed, it's taken over to the wastewater treatment plant and it's mixed in with the rest of the waste that's coming from some small industries and individuals and things of that nature from the wasteline. And what we try to do, or what's done, and I'll try to explain this very simply in my knowledge, but we basically try to partition the water from the solids. Okay, so when we partition and separate these things in the wastewater treatment plant, they kill off various types of pathogens, but no one ever treats for chemicals, which is of concern and a problem. But anyway, we partition the chemicals, go into the water, and are pretty much purified, or what we believe are clean, but we also have to test that material as well. That's called the effluent, okay? And that's what's taken and brought back into the Murray River. What's in the other side, which is the kind of sludge or biosolids as they're called, is basically taken and used as a fertilizer, okay? Because it contains certain nutrients and it's put on a variety of different farmlands. So that's also very, very important to understand. So again, landfill after landfill after landfill, there's a lot of data that shows that over time, the things that come out of landfills, a lot of PFASs that are extremely toxic. If we take them and bring them to the wastewater plant, we tend to isolate them or separate them and concentrate them and put these things into biosolids. And from what I've been educated from Jordan and the guys over at MSA, what we have is Class B biosolids. And this is a study that was done by the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club looked at commercial fertilizers, which are apparently what's called a Class A, or no detectable pathogens. And these might even be a little bit more purified than even a Class A fertilizer. So it doesn't matter, unfortunately, where farmers get their fertilizer from. If it's a biosolid from a wastewater treatment plant, they're getting PFASs. If they go out and buy commercial fertilizer, they're also going to have some level of PFASs. The purification processes in between the Class A and Class B is quite different. As you can see on the right-hand side, this is PFOA and PFOS. These are standards that Maine established, which are down in the lower bottom of the slide. And everything in boldface print and asterisk is things that are out of spec or above what we want. So this is an issue because we're taking leachate, put it into wastewater treatment, separating it out into the biosolids, and it's contaminated and contains these compounds. And there are no differences that are happening other than maybe a higher purification process somehow on a commercial level. Again, this is something from the Sierra Club, and you do have to take things from where there are, but there are numerous schematics like this. I don't know if you remember about a year and a half ago or so, I did a What's in Your Water talk, and I always try to define or explain the life cycle of chemicals because that's very, very important. It's very important because you get to understand what you're being exposed to, and therefore you can calculate dose. The biggest problem with this particular compound, or group of compounds I'm saying, because they have such exceptionally long half-lives in everything, we tend to contaminate and recontaminate and recontaminate. So you have manufacturing plants that have, materials that they're putting into landfill and go into leachate. It goes into our home in way of products like ScotchGard, stain-resistant things that are sprayed on our couches, on our rugs, things of that nature. So these chemicals work their way into a lot of different places. From our home, things that, as we excrete, it goes down into the wastewater treatment plant again to be dealt with and handled. The leachate again goes into the wastewater treatment plant to be handled. If we take this sludge or the biosolids that are formed and we apply it to farmlands or any kind of land, what we see is that all the vegetables or fruits or any type of crop that's grown is contaminated with PFASs. Any animals that will graze and eat that food, including humans, again, becomes contaminated. This is that bioaccumulation concept. So you have this incredible cycle of materials, and I can go on, and actually we could draw lines back and forth between all of these different types of issues or situations. But this is one of the major problems when you have something that can last up to 2 centuries in the ground and can wick up into plants and can contaminate and bioconcentrate into all of our bodies as well as our animals. These are a few studies. Again, I took the EPA data. They did a lot of very interesting work, but this is how PFASs will wick up in different types of products. Okay, these are obviously on the X-axis here. We have all the different types of PFASs. On the Y-axis, we have nanograms per grams. This is the levels of PFAS that they found in either, in this case, the radish root or the radish shoot. And you can see it all varies depending on the PFAS. Some can be very, very high. Some can be virtually zero. The same in celery. Since we eat the celery, the shoot is the most concerning. And if you look at that, that is the gray scale. These materials have pretty high levels. And then they can flip-flop, okay, between the roots and fruits. Again, the same with tomatoes, the same with peas. And the other real issue is really in hay and corn. So if you're using biosolids to fertilize the land and you're growing hay or you're growing corn and you take that and you harvest it and you feed it to animals, you will contaminate not only the farm, but you'll also contaminate all the animals and all kinds of different things. And then unfortunately, as the animals eat these things and become contaminated, they walk around the farm and as they excrete material, they also recontaminate the earth. And so there's a lot of again, passing back and forth and not being able to get rid of things. There was an excellent seminar this afternoon, and it made me actually modify my presentation in a couple of different places. And it was called really Learn from the Experience of Maine. Maine is one of the states, in addition to several, that have significant issues with biosolids and contamination in their land, in their water, in their animals, in their crops, and so forth. There's 2 different stories here. One is from a little township called Arundel in Maine, in York County. This was a guy who basically, he had heard about the PFASs, was concerned about the PFASs, went into his own pocket, took his own money out, and had the milk from the cows tested. And what he found is 690 parts per trillion of PFAS in the cow milk. And that's, of course, very concerning because he could no longer sell the cow milk and he could not actually get his animals to clear. You know, the hardest part after once something is contaminated is finding an environment that's not contaminated to put it in that will kind of clear it out of the animal. And it's definitely not the situation. There is another area called Fairfield Township. This is another small county in Maine. And if you look to your left on the bottom there, Arundel Township has a population of 4,200, and Fairfield Township about almost 6,500. So these are small towns. We're not talking about, you know, populations with 8 million people, 10 million people. New York was those data from the landfills in New York were kind of deceiving because that's actually a couple of those places actually do accept trash from New York City. So you have a much higher volume and things of that nature. So what we're talking about in this particular slide is rural counties, really low population, basically farms. And in the Fairfield issue, again, these were people who bought the farm from a farmer who unfortunately was dying from pancreatic cancer. And at that point in time, they believed that the farmer who was dying from pancreatic cancer told them that he worked with pesticides, did some form of research with pesticides many years ago, and he attributed it to that, not necessarily PFAS, but that was before they knew that this problem existed. When they tested the samples in the soil, they found fairly high levels, everything ranging from about 300 to 1,000 parts per billion. Okay, and then in the surface water, they found somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 parts per trillion. That's really interesting and actually quite frightening. But the thing that was even more interesting is that they actually went out and took wildlife. In other words, they took down about 8 deer and they sampled the deer's meat, and they also sampled the deer's liver, the tissue. And what they found when they calculate using what's called the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, they have that level set at 2 parts per trillion a day. If you went out and shot a deer and you took its liver and you wanted to eat liver, 1 meal per year for a child or an adult would be the level that you would be allowed to eat. So above that, we're talking about what they consider toxic. If we were to talk about the meat, we would talk about 2 meals a year for a child and 4 meals a year for an adult. So this is a little bit different. So not only is it impacting our own food, our own animals, and things of that nature, but actually everything in nature is also being exposed to this material at the same time. And so when you go out and catch wild animals and you use them to supplement your food, this is a really serious issue. This can impact lots of people in rural America. And it's, so again, quite concerning. They went from looking at wild animals and deer to going into the streams and catching fish. And the scale I put on the left-hand side down in the bottom, that's the number of nanograms per gram. If a fish contained 15 nanograms per grams, then you would be able to have 12 meals a year or once a month. Okay, and so on as the scale talks about. If you notice Fairfield County in the section, in the slide, it says, do not eat any species of fish. Okay, so we have a deer advisory, and now we have a fish advisory in certain areas where you can't eat any, and then they're telling you how many meals you can eat in other locations. So what this caused is, again, a great deal of concern in Maine, and a lot of testing started occurring. This is Mr. Stone. He is the farmer in Arundel who discovered the problem in milk in his calves. And this is his statement in a magazine or a cover story. You know, I don't know how we're going to survive. The farmers are facing ruins in Maine, primarily because of forever chemical crisis. There are basically 700 farms, if you look down to the lower left, that may be contaminated in PFAS. Everything that's tested, meaning the soil, the drinking water, the irrigation water, the crops, the animals in these farms are contaminated. They have fairly high levels of PFAS in them, both in their blood, both in their tissue, both in their meat. Again, very, very concerning. What's even more concerning, and I will apologize because I think a few times I did some talks and I talked about, you know, the issue here was that Maine started applying biosolids in the 1990s. When I talked, Barbara Walsh and I talked to the toxicologist in Maine about 2 months ago, and he was explaining that all of this contamination is from the 1990s. So in my feeble head, I said, oh, okay, so they've been applying these things since the 1990s, and that's the problem. Today, it was clarified in the lecture from Maine, they stopped applying biosolids to the land in 1990s. So you have 30, 40 years in which the land was applied and no biosolids were applied. That still has this land so contaminated. Again, this material will last in the soil and water for up to 2 centuries, not to mention in our blood and all kinds of other things. So this is creating a huge, huge issue in Maine. They were able to procure about $30 million to start testing all the 700 farms that they are concerned about. And it's not only the farms that were applied with biosolids, but it's also the farms adjacent to people who use biosolids. In other words, chemicals do not have boundaries. They don't recognize, you know, West Virginia from Virginia or from Pennsylvania to anywhere else. And when it gets in water, it goes in the water. Wherever the water goes, so do the chemicals. And the same with this. When you apply these biosolids to land, they migrate to other areas. And in fact, the studies that were done in the deer were basically done in a 5-mile radius of where they knew they actually applied biosolids. And that's the area that they're talking about. So when you look at it from that perspective, you've got about 700 farms alone in just Maine that might be impacted with high levels of PFASs to the extent that the land is no longer useful, okay? What they were also able to procure in Maine was $60 million in assistance for farmers. So trying to figure out how to procure or how to mitigate the toxicity and all of those kinds of issues, but basically trying to help farmers survive. If your cows are infected and your milk is infected, you can't sell your milk. If you can't sell your milk, you can't make money. The other thing involved is the other farm in Fairfield. that was actually not an animal farm, but it was vegetation and grains they were growing. And of course, the land is completely useless because everything is extremely contaminated. And one suggestion that the people in Maine did make today for these farmlands, what they're trying to recommend, and some of you might react to this inappropriately, or some might not like it, I should say, not inappropriately, but you might like it or will like it. But basically, using these fields for potential alternative energy. So in other words, when you want to put a solar array in, this is the type of land. You cannot use it for doing anything. You can't even live on it. So solar arrays, or perhaps looking for other ways of using alternative energies, are basically the way they're going. Okay, this is the other land. This big story again, I believe this is Mr. Stone's property, his farm again. But all of this has just led to Maine coming out with banning sewage sludge on farms. So this is a practice that's going by the wayside in Maine, obviously because of the seriousness of the contamination and the widespread level of contamination. Michigan is another state that had significant issues, as well as Wisconsin, New Mexico, and so many other states. But Michigan is the only one that now just put a temporary ban on the application of biosolids. So that's really great. But just again, to kind of show you where we are in our country with being split in half, Alabama looks at it as the best use of biosolids is as a fertilizer. So, you know, it just kind of depends on what your concerns are from an environmental perspective and what your views are in relationship to public health. But this is a process now that Maine just banned, Michigan temporarily banned, and if they continue doing research and finding more problems, I'm sure that many states will actually ban this process. So that's basically the issue and the concerns and the problems in relationship to leachate and biosolids and effluent. So the next issue is really mitigation. What do we do with the situation? How do we handle it? How do we get these materials out of our environment, out of our body? This is a slide that came from the Virginia Department of Health presentation. Again, removing these substances from anything has basically been focused really on drinking water. And so these systems are purely for drinking water. There are more pluses and minuses. If you notice up on top, some of them are good at getting rid of long chain carbons. This is the C8, the PFOA and PFOS. Some of them are better at getting rid of smaller molecules. You know, irregardless, whatever you use this for, what you're basically doing is you're concentrating a toxin that you need to figure out what to do with. So whether it's in activated carbon, or whether it's in a membrane, or whether in a reverse osmosis issue, if we can get it out of the water, that's obviously the first place that's of great concern, but not the only place that's of great concern. Obviously, all the information I shared with you on fertilizers and biosolids that contain PFASs are extremely problematic. And so we're at a kind of loss on where to go from here if it's not in drinking water. So primarily speaking, there are a number of things that are happening out there concurrently in a lot of different places. But one of the best things to kind of consider is getting manufacturers to be able to identify products that contain PFAS. This is absolutely critical. This is information we all need to know and understand that relate to our public health. You cannot protect yourself if you don't know how or where you're being exposed to toxic chemicals. And this is a major problem. You will not find a PFAS on an ingredient label. It's just very odd or very rare. I did actually make a product for somebody back in 1999 because 3M would not sell them a PFAS. And I was able to find an alternative PFAS manufacturer that let me use it. And it was in an oily skin product. So just like PFASs inhibit, you know, grease from going through pizza boxes or fast food restaurants and things of that nature, you know, primarily this is, it's just the issue. You have to understand, you have to really know where these compounds are. The other thing is minimizing our use. So if we know where they are, we can determine how to handle it or what we're willing to be exposed to and what we're not being willing exposed to. What's taken out of the equation in public health is the ability for individuals to protect themselves from this exposure. So that is really, really a very important factor. So other than mitigating or minimizing what ends up going into landfills, I mean, obviously, if we're aware of it and we keep reducing the amount of products that we use with PFAS in them, that will reduce the amount of things that go to the landfill. That will reduce the amount of PFAS that end up potentially in the leachate that go into a wastewater treatment plant and get separated into biosolids and are used. So again, a very complicated issue, but at this moment, there's really not a better way of doing it. You know, commercially available methods to capture and remove PFAS from biosolids, they're under development, you know, but storing them and disposing of them, you know, of a contaminated biosolid is not a permanent solution. You can't store it for only so long. This have lots of other health implications that we really need to be considerate of. But again, this is where the conversation really starts to become creative. So different avenues to pursue, and I say this in a collective standpoint because this has to be done by a lot of scientists, and a lot of scientists are working with it. In fact, we even met with a young professor at WNL who's looking at fungi to adsorb, in other words, to complex with PFAS to grab onto it so that perhaps we can then remove it from whatever it's in, whether it be soil or biosolids or waters or things of that nature. There are other ways of doing that chemically. If you remember very early on, I showed you the different types of endings, carboxylic acid, so forth. We can find other chemicals that will be specific to those chemicals that will bind to it, where we can hold on to that molecule and then perhaps separate it out. There's possible physical separation. That's the concept of, you know, a pound of feathers and a pound of lead. If you have a large vat of fluid and you throw both of those in there, the feathers are going to sit on the top because they're lighter, and the lead's going to sink to the bottom because it's heavier. Even though they're both a pound, they will separate based on molecular weight, okay, how heavy or how light they are. And again, I mentioned it earlier about partitioning the PFAS back into the water phase, which would probably get involved with some other form of chemical treatment. And then if we can get it back into the water phase, we at least have some level of technology that can filter those out of the water. Biosolids are the viscosity to them and thicker. There's lots of issues that just do not make it amenable to try to filter them out. It's very hard. And then the only other thing that we really do know that is effective is incineration. Again, but you have to go 1,000 degrees centigrade or higher. It's not for a very long period of time. It's actually just for a few seconds, but still that is a tremendous temperature to really obtain. And I believe just because I think some agencies are concerned that everybody will start going out and burning these things, there's been some warnings about, you know, the incineration process of this. So again, this is kind of where we're brainstorming, kind of where we're talking about kind of the way to handle these things. But again, there is no definitive method to really handle this problem, at least at this time. So just really quick to wrap up, I just want to summarize again, just from a general information standpoint, what do we know about these compounds? We know that they're so ubiquitous that we can't calculate a dose. They're in thousands and thousands of products. We know it's in 98% of people's blood in our country, as high as levels or average level of 10,000 parts per trillion. In independent studies that looked at the impact in breast milk, 100% of breast milk samples tested were found to contain PFAS. Now, I didn't really touch on this. I stayed mainly on the carcinogenicity row. But again, one of the other issues with this molecule is that these molecules are very small. They can absorb through your skin into your blood supply. And not only that, they will absorb through the placenta barrier. Okay, so we are starting exposure in utero. And if you realize that these compounds really became predominant in the 50s and the 60s, if I use myself as an example, I could be generation 1 that was exposed in utero, or certainly exposed in early childhood. I have a child who obviously in utero was exposed as well. My daughter has grandchildren, so her children and my grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren that are also exposed in utero. And I have grandchildren now who have children, I have 3 great-grandchildren. So this is 4 generations of exposure to these compounds. Again, which is very, very problematic. Not only can they be carcinogenic, but they can also produce a variety of developmental and reproductive effects. Something, again, to be extremely concerned about. We do know that PFOA indeed is carcinogenic, according to the National Toxicology Program. We do know that other groups like the International Agency for Research on Cancer has also considered this material to be carcinogenic. We concerned about PFOA, PFOS, and the other Gen X and other types of PFOSs with their carcinogenic potential. Again, we talked briefly on development and reproductive effects. Again, 200 years in the land, in water, 16 years in your blood at least, and potentially 9 months in air. So all I did was take the half-lives and multiply it by 2, and that's where those numbers come from. We do know for sure that farmlands that have been applied with biosolids, and not since the 90s, that stopped in the 90s. Okay, so this is a correction on my part, are contaminated beyond use in Maine. This is a major issue. To what extent and how many farms in Maine and how many farms in our country, it's really unknown. But the thing that's alarming about this is that we have no idea how many times we can apply biosolids to a piece of property before we contaminate it for 200 years. Okay. Again, the commercial application of biosolids to farmland as it exists now, again, trying to do something with biosolids, our waste is just, it's a phenomenal issue that requires lots of conversation, lots of concern. But anyway, as this program exists now, these biosolids are more than likely, I don't know about our county, but at least in other counties, it would be nice to have the products tested in our county to determine if there is a problem or not. But anyway, this process is definitely not the way to go. Okay, as it exists now, it contaminates the land, the air, the water, contaminates crops, dairy, livestock, life, and so forth. And so stopping PFASs from source pollution by banning these chemicals in all products is absolutely necessity. Okay, all right, I will try to be quiet on that, and we'll leave it at that. Can we go to questions?
Gretchen, I've got a few questions.
Yeah, I'm here. And there are a lot of questions.
Well, I'm glad there are a lot of questions. That's excellent.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with the few that were sent before the program. When folks registered. The first question is, are PFAS gone after they leave your body, or are they just excreted to somewhere else?
Excellent. They are just excreted to somewhere else. Okay, again, that whole life cycle concept of contamination and recontamination just goes round and round. They don't go away for decades and centuries.
Okay.
Good question.
Yep. Next question. In Augusta County, some residents are looking for models of effective local regulations or ordinances to manage biosolid monitoring, transportation, storage, and application. Are there any in place in the state of Virginia or nationally that you know of?
No,
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. So I apologize, but yeah.
Yeah. Have any of our local water treatment facilities or sewage treatment facilities tested their water or sewage effluent or biosolids for PFAS?
Right. We have had conversations with both MSA, or the wastewater treatment plant, and also the landfill group. And we've talked to them about this. I've done presentations for them to explain some of the situations. And so I believe that their boards are talking about this particular issue, but as far as I know, they have not tested it yet, but it would be an excellent first place to really start to test it and just determine even if there are if there's any PFOSs in these, in our leachate or in our biosolids or effluent.
Okay. I should also mention, Joe, there's lots of thank yous before and during the presentation.
Oh, okay.
People who are focused on other things like pipelines, but they're very grateful that you are thinking and working on this.
My pleasure, thank you.
Here's one from one of the slides, slide 12. When you mentioned that leachate and biosolids haven't been tested for PFAS yet, you're just speaking about I'm sorry.
About Rockbridge.
Speaking about the situation in Rockbridge specifically, right?
Correct, just specifically. Yeah, There have been many states that have done testing in their leachate and landfills and biosolids. And again, slide 12 is just one representation of 4 different landfills in New York that did test, and this is what they found. But yeah, we do not test we have no data yet, at least in Lexington or Rockbridge County.
Okay. And then here's one from slide number 19.
Okay.
Are biosolids the same thing as sewage sludge? Is it basically just the same thing, 2 names?
Yeah, in my limited language, I'm using them interchangeable, yes. And actually the press and most people that talk about them do say biosolids, fertilizer, but sewer sludge tends to be the new word that people are using. Again, I don't know why, but they're all used fairly interchangeable.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And what is Maine? Do you know what Maine is doing with their biosolids?
They did not cover that in today's lecture. They just said that they stopped all practices of applying biosolids to land. I would imagine for the moment they're storing them. I don't know how long that is a process that can be maintained, but I believe that's what they're doing, and they're pretty frantically looking for different things to do and ways to figure out how to remediate the process or the issues.
Gotcha. And then the last one that was in the chat, farmers spread the biosolids from their farm animals. Do these biosolids contain the PFAS and PFOA risks as much as human biosolids?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, again. And not only that, again, but the animals themselves. So, if you muck out a stall, and you've been feeding that animal hay that's contaminated with PFASs, well, the manure is contaminated, and whatever you use that for will be a problem. And even as the animal just walks around the farm and releases waste, they contaminate them. Again, it's another continual process of contamination as we go forward.
So I'm going to slip in a question here. I see there are 2 other ones from the chat, but I'm assuming that still ultimately is less potential for these chemicals to get in the land than if you just did a blanket spray of biosolids from the landfill. I mean, from the
absolutely. I mean, it's a lesser extent, I think, as far as the amount of material being applied. But again, these materials are so toxic, it down to parts per trillion. It really doesn't take a lot to really cause problems in health issues. Okay.
And 2 more questions were added. Does California test products for any of these compounds? Do you know?
They just, I've been following California. I do work with them from time to time on what's called their Proposition 65. And this is something that they enforced many years ago. Any product that contains a compound that could be carcinogenic or cause developmental or reproductive effects has to bear a label. So they just started banning or adding, not so much banning, they added to the list of Proposition 65 certain chemicals. And they're just starting to come out with their regulations that say, if you have a PFAS in your product, it has to have a warning label on it saying that it could cause cancer or possibly developmental and reproductive effects. But again, this is fairly new, so there's nothing hardcore in process yet, but they are working towards that and have added some of these compounds to the list of Prop 65, what's called.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a test homeowners can purchase to test their soil and water on their personal property?
Yeah, there are a number of ones online that you can buy, but I will caution you. The chemistry to these compounds are fairly tricky, and the home kits that are made, you could probably get a test done for $79, but I would say you probably have a very low level of accuracy of that data being really accurate or correct, if you would. It's a quick and dirty test, for lack of a better term, and I don't think they're very accurate. The tests that really need to be done are instrumentation analysis, and in a laboratory, in an analytical chemistry lab, that's the best way to assay it and quantitate the amount that's in a sample. So
Yikes.
I guess buyer beware, I guess, would be the answer to that
Right,
question.
right.
Yeah.
And then someone's wondering if you can show the slide with the mylogranite, yeah, thank you. I'm sure I said that wrong. How do you say it, Joe?
Is that what nanograms per gram? Is that the slide we're talking about? Do you know?
Mylogranite, I think. If this gentleman or this person does not know the number of the slide. Kip, if you, it looks like it's from you.
Yeah, the Milorganite, and it was something you can buy at Home Depot. Whatever that slide was, where the things that we buy.
Oh, that's commercial. This one.
Yes,
Okay.
that's the one. Thank you. Well,
Oh,
and no, there it is. There's the
Yeah.
Milorganite. Okay, because like you can buy that. I know people that put that on their lawns right now.
In Home Depot, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a home. Well, this one
And-
that was tested was from Home Depot,
Right.
and it did contain, the commercial product. And again, batch to batch variations can be really great. So these numbers might be really reflective of that, and they can be plus or minus a huge level. It's quite variable. But yes, that is the other issue. So yeah, these are what's available out there in commercial forms. And so if you use those fertilizers and you're growing food, more than likely your food is going to wick up the PFASs and you will eat them. That's how we end up with about 10,000 parts per trillion in our blood, primarily. Very good.
Okay, Joe, people keep adding questions. Are biosolids applied to land in Virginia? I know this answer.
Not a lot of properties that I understand, but there are a couple of places that we do use biosolids that are sprayed in Rockbridge County. And I believe it is a practice that's probably used in many places throughout the state. Absolutely.
And then what are the alternatives to land applying biosolids?
Well, again, this is the conundrum. This is a really big problem because if we just use sewer sludge or biosolids, the chances are you're probably getting a higher percentage, but then this creates a financial burden to farmers too, which is very problematic. So if they have to go up and use a higher grade or a higher class of fertilizers that have, significantly lower levels of these compounds in them, you're still going to create the same problem, maybe to a lesser degree. We don't know how long it takes. I mean, does it take one application of biosolids? Does it take 100 application of biosolids or fertilizer to the land before it becomes contaminated beyond use? It's just not something we know. So what I would like to see really happen is that we test biosolids and see what the levels are. We try to come up with a variety of different methods that we can use to try to purify biosolids. But the answer is to both an economic side and a public health issue, is that we have to quickly come up with ways to purify all fertilizers, okay, that are contaminated, and make those publicly available to farmers so we can go back and have healthy products that we're selling and growing.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The next question is whether there's going to be a digital version of this presentation and audio later. And as far as I know, RAC always posts them on the website, and there'll be a link.
Absolutely, there will be. And the one thing that I forgot to mention as well is that I have slide 13 up there, so you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, I have a website listing. So everything on my slides, I have the references for. You can either go find that or click on that, and it will take you to that website if you want to do more research or you want to find out a little bit more about the products. There were a few slides that had lots of different references being made, so I did not put the specific references. But if there is anybody that would like to see any specific piece of research or science that I presented here, you can contact RAC and they'll pass that along to me, and I'll be happy to provide that data so that if you're interested in learning more about it, you can. Okay.
Okay, and then is there an argument for is this an argument for synthetic fertilizers? There you go. There's a trick question for you, Joe.
That is a trick question, isn't it? You know, I unfortunately don't have a good answer for you on that. But, you know, again, anything that does not contain PFASs is a very viable alternative. I don't know what the economic impact to using synthetic versions are, but yeah, of course.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah. Someone's commenting that, you know, he doesn't want to ask too many questions. I guess he's already asked some earlier ones. He says it's a very interesting conversation. Are there any groups working to get the companies that are, sorry, my computer's having issues. Companies that are using PFAS in their packaging to change their processes? Wouldn't it be best to get it out of the system altogether?
Yes, it would be. And that is actually the overall goal. You know, one of the issues that actually came up in Maine, and it has come up before, that there are pesticides that sometimes are used in components that contain fluorine. And the pesticide will take that fluorine out of the package and actually form PFASs in the product. So there are a number of manufacturers that know this, but the issue here is that if it's not against the law, if there's not a ban or some kind of, you know, some kind of requirement saying that these cannot be used, manufacturers will continue to use them. And that's the biggest problem. You know, there were several bills. I think the EWG did a big symposium with Debbie Dingle and a bunch of other different representatives from our government, you know, passing this bill to ban PFASs in, you know, all personal care products and to ban PFASs there. The Congress came up with one, the Senate has a bill, both of them passed it, you know, and then they have to go to the opposite, and neither one of them will pass either one. So right now, everything that's in our government is stalled. No one wants to vote. No one wants to do anything with these things. The phrase that's most common is, we need more research. And in reality, you know, if you went back to slide 1, you know, we don't need more research. We know that, you know, the last 70 years of dealing with this compound has produced significant problems. And again, one of the things that I mentioned is that once something becomes carcinogenic, there are laws on the books, and we have a citizens petition, and we meaning RAC, along with a few other individual groups, put in a petition to FDA to say, hey, the law says that, you know, materials that contaminate our food chain that are carcinogenic are not allowed to be there. Okay, and FDA will tell you that biosolids contaminates the food chain. But yet we wrote a petition to say, we'll ban PFASs, you know, from use. I mean, they shouldn't be in our food chain, period. So there are laws on the books that can be used right now to ban these. But again, because of the huge complexity and the thousands of compounds, and it's intertwined economically on so many levels, everybody's afraid to do anything. So we will never stop manufacturers from using it, just like Nike, who, you know, 10 years ago said, we're going to get rid of everything. And now 10 years said, oh, we're going to be another 5 years, we'll get rid of it. Industry will never get rid of it unless it's a requirement to get rid of it.
So Joe, I wanted to ask a question. I hope that's okay, Gretchen.
Yes, all the questions from the chat are completed.
Well, I want to know where specifically the contaminant. I understand the leachate from the landfill, a lot of consumer products, is a big source of the PFAS in our biosolids. But I'm curious to know, is there other sources from the water itself that's not from the leachate? And the reason I ask that is because it occurs to me that the fissile material is actually not contaminated, except maybe lightly from our own blood. But so therefore, thinking about ways to manage our manure that does not mix it with the water where the contamination comes from. So I'm curious to know of other contaminating sources other than the leachate.
That's probably one of the biggest concerns. Of course, PFAS again are not considered environmental toxins, so you can still get permits to dump PFAS in water. So that would probably be the next level of contamination. Companies that manufacture PFAS that can actually legally either put them in a dump that will eventually erode the components and the material will get back into the water, or they'll deposit it directly into the water. So yeah.
But the PFAS going into the sewer pipes, specifically the sewer pipe.
Right.
And I understand you put it in the stream, then that's kind of a general pollution,
Right.
but the manure itself is lightly contaminated, I would presume, but it joins up with these other contaminants, and that's where it becomes unuseful.
Well, it becomes concentrated, right. It does become concentrated, in the process. But, again, the average consumer has 10,000 parts per trillion in their body. You release about 8% of that a year. So again, it's probably to a lesser degree, but it's still a significant source of contamination. I know we had talked about separating, using different lines to handle that. And so, yeah, you're right. It would be to a less degree, but again, every location is going to be very specific to that location. And until we test those things, we really don't know. So,
well, I'm going to post a link to the chat that was discussed this, and there's a sewage treatment plant in Pennsylvania that is attempting to address this issue, and they do it by creating using the biosolids to digest into methane, and then burning that for energy use in a combustion use, and then taking the digestate from that and then pyrolyzing it into charcoal. And as you pointed out, the temperatures aren't high enough to destroy for what would be biochar, but it could be used as charcoal in steel production, which does get to the temperatures that would destroy the PFAS, and or you could add the charcoal into concrete, in which case it would contain it and not put it in the water and be harmless. So those are two potential mitigating things that I'm looking at.
And I think both of those are excellent ideas, and we certainly need to pursue them as fast as we possibly can. And they make sense to me. I mean, that is one way of managing it. I don't think it's the long-term solution. The long-term solution is we need to get rid of these types of compounds and find replacements for them. Yeah.
Stop the contamination is the highest priority.
Right. Exactly.
Continuing contamination. We're already contaminated, but
right. We are actually already contaminated, and we've been continuing to contaminate ourselves for, about 6 decades or so. Yeah. Good.
So I don't see any other hands up as I scan through things. I think the questions, we might have gone through the questions, and now that Eli has solved how to how to remove the current level of PFAS and everything, we're good here.
Bad ideas, yeah, definitely.
No, there's a great ideas. I like it.
Bold claim to be saying solved, but I see there are potentials if we just think outside of the box. I know that the cultural barriers to thinking outside of the box are formidable, but when we don't have the answer with our conventional approach, then it demands on us to reconsider some of our basic assumptions, like the 5-gallon flush.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and the concept here is to have this conversation with as many different people with different backgrounds. We all see things a little different than other people sometimes. So, it's really good to open up the conversation, not to exclude anybody, because, anybody's guess is as good as anybody else's. And unfortunately, I know people believe that science is an exact thing, but science is just educated guessing, and nothing more than that. So, yes, good.
Joe, there is one more question that Sherry Balcom just added. If a farmer has only utilized biosolids from their own farm with no evidence of contamination of PFAS, should there be a difference in results seen from using biosolids from landfills? Does that make sense?
So let me just reiterate it then. So in other words, if a farmer is using or developing their own biosolids and it is clean of PFAS, yeah?
Well, the question, I don't know if Sherry wants to talk.
Yeah,
to
Sherry, you can jump on, Sherry. I don't know if she's able to do that though. Is she allowed? Will the Zoom let her?
She would just have to.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so, and I guess the question was made with and maybe this needs to be cleared up to be able to ask the question is,
Sure.
the farmer is using their own manure or their own biosolids as their
Fertilizer.
Is it assumed that that biosolid is already contaminated regardless of, I know you've talked about what's happening in Maine, but let's say in Virginia.
Yeah.
Are we assuming that that biosolid coming from their own farm and their own animals already contains the PFAS?
So, again, it becomes a very complicated issue, but so if that farmer is using hay to feed his animals, okay, and that hay was grown on fields that were biosolid treated with, PFASs that contain PFASs, the farmer might have be contaminating his animals by the feed. Okay, so that's one issue there. And then, if we make a basic assumption, for lack of a better term, let's assume that everything on that farm is pure, no biosolid, no PFASs are involved, and no contamination, then there's no issue. So primarily, if there's no PFASs, at least at this moment, that's the major concern in the fertilizers. So if that's the case, yeah, then the farm is not contaminated. But again, you have to understand in toxicology, again, it's not a democratic process. Everything is considered toxic until proven non-toxic. So, again, the PFASs are so ubiquitous that the likelihood that they don't exist on a farm somewhere is probably very unlikely. But that would be the right model to use. Contain everything, control everything, really be able to understand what you're feeding the animals, what you're using, what you're growing, to the best that you can. And if that's the case, then you have an excellent, you have a good system going. But I just don't know how real that actually is. Everything I've learned and everything I've researched to date implies that basically everything is contaminated or has some level of contamination. So that's where the problem is. Did that answer your question? I apologize.
Yes, I grew up on a farm in North Carolina where the family farm, they use their own biosolid, and
Sure. Yeah.
the question there was, most of the hay was grown on that land where that biosolid was used.
Right.
There wasn't any additional brought in from outside. So I guess just curious if how many farms in Virginia or in Rockbridge County would that be true for here, and would still be that contamination? How much of a problem would we really be looking at?
Right. So the other concept to using your own biosolids, composting toilets or commodes have been, they've come in and out of favor many times over the decades. But it's not an unusual concept. But again, remember, the 98% of Americans have 10,000 parts per trillion on average of PFAS in their blood and in their body. And you get rid of about 8% of that a year. So even your own waste, your own biosolids, has a fairly high potential of being contaminated. Eli brought up the point, probably less contaminated than, a concentration, coming from a wastewater treatment plant. But again, these materials are just so ubiquitous, and they're in everything, including us, that, having a zero level would probably be very hard for me to believe, but certainly better than most situations, definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd like to address that question about the fertilizers, having fertilizers be reconsidered as a result of the problems with the sewer sludge. And I would say the far better approach to that is to improve the biology in the soil, which is a source of free fertilizer. So with a rising price of fertilizer, farmers may feel squeezed and consider the biosolids, and so that's not a good alternative. But the alternative to the fertilizer, because they have issues too, in that they reduce the biology in the ground, and adding the biology to our ground, increasing the organic content in the ground, increasing the carbon in the ground, has so many benefits that instead of reconsidering chemical fertilizers, we should encourage our farmers to take the steps to increase the biology in the soil, because that is where there can be real gains to the environment.
Yes, I agree, definitely. Okay. We good? Any more questions or?
Good job.
No, I don't see any more questions, and it
Great.
is 8:31,
Yes,
All right.
like perfect timing. I
very good.
apologize if I have missed a question along the way. This is the first time I've done this, and I
Thank
might
you.
have missed one, but I don't think I did.
You did very well. I certainly appreciate it. It's very difficult in this format to look at the questions coming in and do the presentation and try to answer everything. So I certainly
Of
appreciate your
course.
help, and Eli as well. And Mr.
Absolutely,
Manley
Joe.
is
Thank you so
back there
much. This
somewhere.
was
Yes.
so informative.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Everybody have a wonderful night, and we'll talk to you all soon.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night.